Provisions to ensure equal pay for equal work have been in place for decades, but a step change has yet to happen. WTW provides employers with confidence that their pay and benefits are fair and equitable, not just today, but into tomorrow.
Hello, and welcome to the next in our series of videos on pay clarity and visibility. I'm Tamsin Sridhara, and I'm joined by my colleague Eva Jesmiatka. In this video, we are revisiting the topic of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and we are going to focus on categories of worker. Now, Eva, before we go into the detailed discussion, I think it's probably worth highlighting that the purpose of the directive was to reinforce employers' obligation to deliver equal pay, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore, this theme about equal pay for equal work runs through the directive, and it's against that we need to consider categories of workers.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's also something that is new compared to what we've seen in other existing legislation.
Yeah. Given it's new, should we start with the basics then? So where in the directive does the concept of categories of worker come up?
Yeah, so it's in a couple of areas where categories of workers is really key. So first of all, we're seeing it in relation to the employee right to information. So where employees will have the right to request average pay levels, organizations need to make sure to provide that information by category of worker and broken down by gender. So that is one. Mm-hmm. The second one is actually in relation to the gender pay gap reporting. So what we know is that organizations need to calculate gender pay gaps, both at an entity level, but also, again, at a category of worker level. And as we know, the directive might require companies to take action. And that's also why we'll be looking at the gender pay gaps by category of worker. Because if those exceed 5% and the organization cannot explain gaps with objective reasons, then the organization either needs to take action or you'll be into a joint pay assessment with your worker representatives.
So in summary then, the reason the concept of categories of work is so important, it is the basic unit of compliance in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And then if you've got to prepare around that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So given that you said it's new, can you then just explain exactly what we mean now by categories of worker?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of the most frequently asked questions that we see coming up from the clients that we work with. So let's go actually to the directive itself and what we know to date in terms of the definition that is confirmed in there. And in there we see that categories of workers is defined as workers that perform same work or work of equal value. And when it comes to work of equal value, what the directive also indicates is the way to establish that could be by using job leveling, and you need to make sure that you're using gender neutral and objective criteria as well for establishing that.
So I think, and this is where for many of our clients, isn't it, they have had to grasp that we are no longer just talking about same work and similar work. What the directive is really emphasizing is the right to equal pay is work of equal value, and that can then look across jobs at the same level, and hence the importance of your job leveling framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also something that we are consistently hearing from any legal professionals with whom we're working, that the work of equal value concept is absolutely key in all of this and should be, in essence, your absolute starting point to begin with.
So the other lesson we're drawing out from that, it's fundamental. Secondly, job leveling structure is key. Now, third question for you is who then gets to determine the categories of worker for in an organization?
Yeah, so that's another question that we see coming up a lot. And what we know to date is that it will most likely be the employer who actually gets to define the category of workers. So what we're learning from member states as they're looking at transposing the directive is that they're not planning to provide any specific categories of workers that organizations need to map to. But there's broad recognition that organizations have established job frameworks in place, and that their existing frameworks could offer the foundation for defining what is in your organization considered as work of equal value in essence.
So the starting point is you've got your employee, you've got their job structure, job leveling structure. Is there anybody else either that they need to formally engage with on this, and or are we finding in practice that there are other, I mean, obviously there's ourselves, but there are other people that they're consulting with in terms of trying to come up with this?
Yeah, no, really good question. And I would say there are two key stakeholder groups that you really want to think about. And let's first of all, again, look at what might be required by local country law. And if we then look at the role of worker representatives, such as works councils, what we know is that already in some of the EU member states, if as an organization you're going to introduce a new job leveling methodology, you might need to get approval or consent from your works council. So what the directive is also alluding to is the rights of worker representatives in relation to the directive. And when it comes then to defining your categories of workers, you might need to look for their consent to it, or maybe at the minimum, their consent to what are the criteria that are being used to define work of equal value in this organization. So worker representatives, I would really flag as one group to consider, to plan to engage with. The second one is legal, because they will of course also have a perspective on this, knowing the organization, also then advise what is for us as an organization the best approach to consider here.
So, I mean, certainly when you and I, we have been having the conversations with clients about categories of workers, we've tended to find it's been the core project team, and then ourselves, and then legal have provided that very helpful view, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always find when we work or when we partner with legal, so we of course very much bring the rewards and talent and HR perspective, but they can really provide a very helpful legal perspective, also considering what do we, for example, see happening in relation to case law in Europe.
Yeah, and for some clients, they've got to manage then the balance between kind of talent risk and legal risk, and that, you know, it helps inform that discussion. Okay, so we understand who determines. The next question is, so what then are we seeing clients do in terms of interpreting it in terms of their own job structures?
Yeah. So we actually recently run a number of polls on this to really understand what is the direction that companies are going into. And what we are seeing is that there are a number of approaches that are emerging to be the most prevalent. Actually, the first one that's most prevalent is by looking at really work of equal value. So that might be that organizations decide to take quite a broad grouping approach by, in essence, grouping all employees together who are in a role that is in the same job level, regardless, for example, of the job family group or the function. So that's one. Then the second approach that a lot of companies are thinking about is by adding in, not only looking at job level, but adding in the job architecture constructs. So for example, looking at a role in job level X and in job family Y. When we are looking at those options, and this is again where you can probably also already hear the legal colleagues coming in, they will hammer on identifying, is that truly work of equal value? And when we bring in a job architecture construct, are we absolutely clear and confident that we are grouping roles based on skill requirements and that those are truly gender neutral? So that can
be too narrow. And if you are looking purely at job family and job family and level, that then may not be actually looking truly at work of equal value. And certainly with a client last week, they were then differentiating more at the same level between sales and non-sales. So looking at some sort of categorization, but more broadly than the job family.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're actually touching on also very practical consideration. As you indicated, by adding in the job architecture component as well, you start looking at quite a narrow view. And the practical consideration there is, are you even able to go that granular from a headcount perspective? And in my experience from looking at this with some of my clients, they often begin with indicating, we want to look at both job leveling and job architecture. But then when we try to break down the workforce into those groups, and of course you need to consider you have both males and females that you need to have in those groups before you can actually share any data, they will find often that it would create a lot of groups, but a lot of them would not have sufficient headcount or might not even consist of both genders.
And then you get a lot of volatility happening, just simply dealing with small sample sizes. And you can take some of those considerations into the objective factors. So if you're not using them to categorize work, you could use them potentially to explain difference as well.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned works councils before. Now I've got some clients who might have job leveling frameworks for their management population, but then they use some sort of classification within their collective bargaining agreement. Is that another factor you have to take into account?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are an organization where you have, in essence, within a country, some part of the population covered by collective bargaining agreements and with their own classification systems, you might need to consider where for that population, it makes most sense to use, in essence, those classification systems. And then for the population that is outside the collective bargaining agreement, to use the leveling framework that is used for those roles.
So you've identified three most common starting points, which starting with level, and then considering level plus some sort of vertical, and then also having to reflect Works Council's classifications. How then are clients practically moving from discussing those different options to deciding what is the most robust and appropriate basis for them?
Yeah, I think that's where you really want to start with testing.
Yeah.
So take real data and start looking at what is feasible if we look at the headcount numbers. If we group in different ways, what will it do also to the numbers? Because as you highlighted, if you only have 5 individuals within a group, your numbers get very volatile. And that doesn't immediately indicate we have a pay equity issue. It just shows that it only takes one small outlier.
One person to leave and join, and then...
Yeah, exactly. So testing the data would be, from our perspective, a recommended starting point. And then use the findings to come to a proposal, which you probably want to test with your legal counsel. And then you want to start thinking about, can we start planning for when we might want to socialize this also with our workers' representatives to make sure that they understand the direction that we're planning to go into and make sure that they are comfortable with the approach that's being taken.
Thanks, Eva. So obviously, what this has highlighted, there's quite a lot to work through around categories of worker. In good interviewer style, can you then finish by giving perhaps 3 or 4 top tips to those people who are listening?
Yeah. So I think it's probably reiterating the last points that we just talked about. So look at what are your options. Look at what is our current approach to job leveling, and are we confident that it's done in a gender neutral and objective manner? But that could then form a really strong foundation. Test the options with using actual data, and then based on that, form your recommendations and start running that by some of those key stakeholders that we talked about. So legal to begin with, and then obviously in conversation, probably with your employee relations team, identify when can we start socializing this with our workers reps as well.
Okay, thank you. So we've got leveling structure, develop your options, test your options, and then consult on them.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Eva, and thank you all for joining us.